Okay, so whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Luke. Great. Yeah. So we'll start out by having everybody go around and talk about what they're thankful for. Nah, I'm kidding. Don't worry. I'm not putting you on the spot. Um, so yeah, like Luke said, my name is Michael. I have been a front-end software engineer for about 7 years now. And I started out kind of working more on the back end, more full stack. And then as I progressed through my career, I spent a lot of time. I spent about 4 years at T-Mobile, which I had a great experience. I learned a lot from the engineers that I was working with there. And I was introduced to an accessibility team and some work on component libraries and things like that that I hadn't been exposed to before. So in building that work, I kind of was exposed to this whole world of web accessibility and how it can improve a product in the long run. And it really resonated with me and I enjoyed working on it. And that's kind of where my career has drifted more since then. So I'm very focused on the front end and specifically focused on accessibility. That's where my passions lie for the most part. Yeah. And I'm really happy to be here to be able to share with you guys. So thank you everyone for showing up and being willing to listen to this topic. We'll try to make it as exciting as possible. So, and Luke, I think I think I need permission to go ahead and do the screen share on that.
Let's see. All right, let me see if I could give you. Let me make you the co-host.
Okay,
All right.
perfect.
So you should be
Thank
able
you.
to do this.
All right, and I'm on a wide monitor here, so hopefully, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and select the application to share.
Yeah.
And then go into presenter view. All right. Are you guys seeing the whole entire thing or just the main slides there?
You can see the slides,
You can just see the slides? Okay.
but
Cool.
not the main one. If you are talking about the main, like the whole.
Like the presenter view. Okay, perfect. Yeah. No spoilers.
No, the presentation view. So yeah, you can see your slides, like all the slides light up.
Oh, you can. Okay. Hold on. Let me try this one more time. I'm gonna try to just share my entire monitor and then see if that's too wide. Okay. All right. How about now? What does that look like?
I think it's fine. Yeah, I think I could. Yeah. How about you guys? Can you guys see? It's
We
fine.
can still see all your slides. We can see all of them still.
Okay. That is not a big deal. If you can still see those, we can just roll with it. I wish there was a feature in Zoom where you could just do like a section of the screen. So sorry about that. But no, let's get started. I'm gonna go ahead and make this really small then. So that way we can kind of focus on this here. Okay, perfect. Great. So let's talk about web accessibility. So accessibility in the web is something that a lot of people have strong feelings about. A lot of people don't know a whole lot about at all. And to me personally, it is the heart-shaped hole in the modern web. And we'll kind of get into a little bit as to of what that means as we keep going through this presentation here. But I'm looking forward to getting into it. So first of all, I want to just look over kind of the agenda, what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to go through a few different things. We're going to talk about what web accessibility is. We're going to go over some terminology because I hate when people dive in and start throwing acronyms out there and nobody has any idea what the acronyms mean, or, there's assumptions made about where everybody's coming from. And we'll talk a little bit about the history of it. We're going to talk about some misconceptions around web accessibility and how it is different and more than what a lot of the assumptions are about it. We're going to talk about something called the curb cut effect, which may sound a little confusing right now, but I think it'll be clear once we get there. We're also going to talk about the empathy gap, which is another term that is a little vague, but once we get into it, hopefully that becomes clear as well. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of practices that you can take with you when you are developing applications that you can make your applications more accessible right out of the box. We're not going to dive super deep into too much, but I want to give just a couple of things for you to keep in mind that can hopefully give you some quick wins as you're developing your own products. Alrighty. So we have a quote here. The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. This is a quote from Tim Berners-Lee. I really like the message here, and this kind of encompasses what web accessibility is all about. All right, let's dive into some terminology. Let's get this part out of the way. Okay, perfect. So accessibility is the topic we're talking about here. And one thing that's interesting is you'll notice a lot of the time on the web, when you see the word accessibility written, it's written out as ALLY. And the reason for that is because there are 11 letters between the first and last letter in the word, which I don't know why people are too lazy to type the whole word out. I guess it's kind of long, but it's not insanely long. But whenever you see A11Y, uh, a lot of people will call that ally. I've heard some people say ally, which is a new one. I don't say that, but that means accessibility. So when you see that, that's what it's talking about. And also, I don't know if you're familiar with internationalization or localization, where basically you have to make your application support different languages, which is kind of a subset of accessibility, but you'll see that as I18N, which is the same concept. So it's I, then 18 letters for nationalization as the N at the end. So just so you know, that's how those are formatted. Okay, so terminology. So we are going to be talking about assistive technologies, modality, people first language, and WCAG. So assistive technologies, when we're talking about that, we're basically just talking about screen readers, which is a tool that people who are blind or low vision use to be able to navigate websites. There are tools like VoiceOver, which comes built in with Mac, NVDA, which is a free and open source screen reader, and then JAWS, which is the most commonly used one for Windows, but it is fairly expensive. So for testing purposes, we're normally using VoiceOver and NVDA. Closed caption is an assistive technology that, a lot of everybody uses these days. You're in a bar, you're watching a football game, whatever, you're using those closed captions to be able to see what's going on the screen. Keyboard focus. So anybody who's navigated a website using just their keyboard, or they are tabbing to the next form field as they're filling something out, that's an assistive technology using a keyboard. So anything that allows you to interact with a web page and how you do it, which kind of leads us into modality. Modality is the method of interaction. And there's actually a lot more methods of interaction that you may have been familiar with in the past. At least I had learned a lot in the last few years about these. So there's keyboard and mouse. That's pretty standard. Some people just use the keyboard. If they're using a screen reader, the mouse is not usually very helpful for them if the person is completely blind or low vision enough that seeing the screen is actually not helpful to them. There's also other really cool devices called single input devices. So people who have disabilities like cerebral palsy or something like that, where they can't move, they're very, very limited in their motion. Sometimes they could use like their fingers, and they can push one button, or they even use a straw, which is called like a puff device, I think. So you can actually blow air out and suck air in to basically create input into your computer that will allow you to open a piece of software that will navigate through, and then you can click once the highlight area is on the right letter or whatever. It's really amazing to watch people use these single input devices, and I encourage you to go research those. It's really cool. But that's a modality, is the way that you are interacting with the computer or with the web page. Excuse me. And then next up, we're going to talk about people first language. You'll see this as an acronym PFL sometimes. And basically, this is just a way to kind of contextualize how we talk about disabilities and people with disabilities. Because I know a lot of times jumping into this topic, people are kind of hesitant to use words and like to kind of describe things that they're trying to talk about. They don't want to offend people. They don't want to say something the wrong way. And basically, people first language is really simple. It's just put the person or the individual first when you're talking about it, and then what kind of you're trying to explain or describe afterwards. So, you would say a person who's blind instead of a blind person. And I know it kind of seems like a bit of a nitpick, but it's actually really important, because when we say something like a blind person or a wheelchair bound person, it has a bit of a different connotation. We want to emphasize the the individuality of the person rather than being defined by their disability. So this is something people use a lot when we're talking about this stuff. And then next we have something called WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We're not going to dive too deep into this today, but this is basically the standard put out by the W3C that is all the guidelines, super detailed, nuts and bolts as to like how you need to implement accessibility into your website. And that's something you might see pop up whenever you're looking at this stuff. And then lastly, has anybody seen this cool thing, this picture here on the right-hand side? Has anybody seen this before?
Nope, not to me.
So I just found this recently, and this is the coolest thing in the world. You might recognize that PlayStation logo. So the PS5 is coming out with this new controller that's called the Sony Access controller, and it's actually made by Sony. So if you want to see some real cutting edge modalities for the PS5 that are assistive technologies that are very, very cool, take a look at the Sony Access controller. It actually comes out next month. It's not even out yet, but this is something that is used for people with limited mobility to be able to play video games on the PlayStation. And it's like this total, like you can take off those little buttons and caps and put them wherever you like and replace which, you know, triangle, square, whatever it is, like you can change out how it works. And then you have the joystick there. Some people use two of them at the same time, but it's super cool. And it's a really good example of amazing user experience and user testing, and also just accessibility in general. Okay. Alrighty, so a little bit of history here. So in 1973, there was something called the Rehabilitation Act was enacted, and this basically just prohibited active discrimination against people with disabilities. So it was a very low level, broad kind of act that was passed. It was very important. It was very important for the time, but it didn't enact a whole lot of change. It was basically just kind of a general acceptance that all these people are, everybody's equal here, regardless of ability or disability. In 1990, we actually got to see a lot more progress in this area, where the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, which bolstered public and workplace equality, came around. The ADA is where we started getting some real actual change. So we see things like, you know, the arm bars in restrooms, or handicap accessible doorways. The ability to even get a wheelchair through a doorway wasn't something that was necessitated by builders before 1990. So this was a big breakthrough for accessibility. And then in 1998, we get Section 508, which was the Rehabilitation Act amended to include technology and web. This was huge for the area that we all work in, where basically saying that the world that we live in needs to be accessible, and the web is such a big part of the world that we live in that is now included with all of those ideologies. This is a super condensed timeline. Obviously, there's only 3 things on here, but I wanted to keep it short. I don't want to go too deep into the history of all this stuff. But this is kind of showing you that, you know, there was basically nothing before 1973. So accessibility is a fairly new topic. It's a fairly new idea, especially when we're bringing it into the web. So the more you guys can learn about it, the more kind of on the cutting edge of this kind of stuff you're going to be, which is great. I'm hoping this is the most boring slide in the whole presentation. So hopefully this stays interesting. Okay, let's talk about some misconceptions around accessibility. A lot of people think web accessibility is only for people who are blind. Is there anybody who thought that this might be the case previously? Anybody brave enough to put emojis in there? Another misconception is that design will suffer if we try to accommodate everyone. And accessibility is too difficult to implement. So these are just a couple things that I have heard people say about why accessibility is not tenable or is difficult, you know, or that it's going to make the product suffer. And that kind of seems to be the primary knee-jerk reaction that people have when they think about it. But in reality, you know, first of all, thinking about people who are blind. So the range of users that benefit from practicing web accessibility is huge. It's very, very wide. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that in depth, which I think should hopefully be a little eye-opening as to how accessibility serves us as developers and as users. And the design argument is very strange to me, because design exists to serve our users, and the constraints that we have when we're designing things, that generates a better and more focused product usually, which is very, very helpful to creating something good. We don't want to have this total green field open. You can do absolutely anything you want, because that kind of your creativity kind of dies out in that environment. And accessibility, people thinking it's too difficult to implement, it does have a learning curve, but often the biggest roadblocks to our users can be removed with really, really simple, really fast changes. So some of the easiest things to implement within accessibility give us the biggest gains. And then as you dig in deeper, there's more complexity that you can get out of it and you can learn. But starting out, it's not hard to get really quick gains really fast, really easily. Okay. Accessibility is for everyone, and everyone benefits from accessibility. This is one of the core tenets of web accessibility. So I kind of want to talk about the broader range of our users that we're looking at here. So legally blind is a term that gets thrown around, and people hear that and they think a person with glasses and the stick trying to walk across the street, they can't see anything. That happens. There are people who are 100% blind, but a vast majority of people who are legally blind can still see in some capacity. They have a varying range of vision. And a lot of those people are using screen readers. And a lot of those people are actually expanding the text on their computer to be really large so that they can navigate still. A lot of those people still use mouse and keyboard. And that's a variation of low vision, not necessarily complete blindness. So that's really not a black or white differentiation there. So legally blind and low vision, it's a huge scale. A person with cataracts, a person who's very old even, could fall into that category. We also have accessibility for people with cognitive disabilities and different levels of tech literacy. I think this one's really important. So cognitive disabilities, obviously you could have dyslexia or something like that, where reading complicated sentences or large chunks of text becomes difficult to get through and hard to process. And just the overload, the mental load and of going through certain sites can actually be very taxing. But then there's also tech literacy. So my mom, for example, has the lowest tech literacy out of anyone I've ever met. She still can't figure out how to lock her phone. Like, I keep telling her to push the button on the side of her iPhone before she puts it in her purse, and she never does it. So she's butt dialing people, she's sending pictures to people, she's texting. It's crazy. And like, her tech literacy is very low. And I watch her interact with applications sometimes, and usually she's making some kind of mistake, but often it's like, oh, okay, this is a confusing flow. This isn't worded properly. This didn't help you. Like, this didn't help you at all. And she's already prone to making mistakes, which is frustrating. So that's something accessibility can address as well. Limited access to fast internet. This one is huge. So, most people in the world do not have extremely fast internet, and most people in the world are navigating with mobile devices. So if you are building a website out that you've tested with your gigabit download speed, and you have 1,000 different node modules, and you're using all these libraries and all this cool animations and stuff, and it looks great on your end, but as soon as you send that to a browser that has extremely low connectivity, they're never going to be able to load your page. So you really want to think about that when we think about accessibility, is that it's a very broad umbrella, and it's about who can access your stuff. We have, non-native language speakers. So, we talk about cognitive disabilities and keeping language simple. That actually really benefits people who might be using a website that's in French, but their native language is German. So then they can actually get through these forms and elements faster and easier because it's not their native language. We have vestibular disabilities. So everybody's seen that, that thing pop up that says, warning, this movie has flashing lights and it could cause seizures. That is something that we need to consider on the web as well. There's a lot of animations that have been really popular, thankfully a little bit more in the past now, especially like the parallax scrolling thing. I don't know if you guys have ever been on awards, awwwards.com. It's like a UI and UX awards site that they take websites and give them awards for being, extra fancy or cool. But I really hate that website because everything is moving all over the place, and you scroll down and the whole site shifts sideways, and it's just like this crazy experience, and it's totally unpredictable. That's kind of the heart of it. So you want your content to be predictable as a user navigates, because you want to take into account people who might have something like a vestibular disability. We also have motor impairments. So we have cerebral palsy. Something like arthritis is even a motor motor impairment. You know, a lot of people's hands, you get more closed up. You're not able to type as quickly or use your mouse as effectively when you have arthritis. Then we have color blindness. So we're going to talk about contrast a bit. And then temporary disabilities. This one is a huge branch as well. So let's say you break your wrist and you can't type and you can't use your mouse with your right hand. Maybe you have to use the mouse with your left hand. Let's say you broke your collarbone and you're in a sling, then you're just going one-handed. Let's say you have a baby and you're carrying your baby around and you need to be able to do something really quickly with one hand. This is a temporary disability. All these kind of things can be can fall under the umbrella of accessibility. So the whole purpose of this is to kind of start thinking that in this graphic at the bottom here, is that there's a statistic that 1 in 5 people have a disability. And that is kind of like the standard criteria for a disability. But when we start considering all these things, we begin to realize that everybody at some point in their life is going to benefit from assistive technologies, regardless of whether or not you have a traditional disability. Okay, moving on. So let's talk about the curb cut effect. The curb cut effect was basically when they started taking curbs and putting ramps on them so that you could enter an intersection and then exit the intersection on wheels in a wheelchair. And that was what it was initially built for. They only did that after the ADA was enacted in 1990. So in 1990, the ADA was enacted and they said, this legislature, the first thing we're going to do is get rid of these curbs that people can't ride their wheelchairs off of so that people can get in and out of intersections and navigate the city. And there was a ton of pushback. There was pushback from the builders, the designers, the city. Nobody wanted to do this. Everybody thought, why would we put effort into fixing this one thing for 1% of the population that costs us so much money? And they had all these reasons why this was a bad thing to do. But because of the ADA, they had to do it. And these cities started to implement this. And as the curb cuts were implemented, you found that this benefited so much more than just people in wheelchairs. There were people with strollers. There are people on bicycles. There's elderly people who have a harder time lifting their leg up that distance to get on the curb. Even if you're just walking, if you look at an intersection, almost everyone will take the curb cut. They will walk to the curb cut because it's just easier. And it has given an insanely broad range of benefit to everyone, and nobody disagrees with that now. So when we talk about the curb cut effect, that's basically when we're looking at our technology, we're looking at the web and we're looking at web accessibility, and we say we're implementing a feature or we're doing something a certain way for a small group of people. The curb cut effect is basically realizing that that is going to positively impact an extremely large range of your users and people that you never even thought of before, as long as you are accommodating for the broadest range possible. So that's the curb cut effect. You'll hear that referenced a lot. There's a couple technical examples here I threw in as well. So if you are using simple language for people who have dyslexia or cognitive impairment, and you're trying to avoid using overly complex words that aren't necessary in your application, non-native language speakers are going to benefit. Everyone can read it faster. It just benefits everybody on your website. If you're using high contrast visuals for low vision and color blindness, then people are going to benefit who are in the bright sunlight on their mobile device. They're going to be able to actually see your website better because of that. And it also just reduces eye strain. You know, you ever been on a website that's in dark mode and the text is like dark gray and you're like, oh my goodness, I could barely read anything here. That's just not helpful to anyone. So when we're solving for one, we can extend that to many. That's the idea of the curb cut effect. I'm going to use one more example here just to drive the point home. I think it already has, but doorknobs versus door levers. Do most of you guys have levers in your house, or do most of you guys still have doorknobs in your house? Mostly knobs? Okay, interesting. Yeah, it might vary a bit, but in my house, I mostly have levers, and I find it really, really useful. I'm really glad I don't have doorknobs in my house. These were initially added to accommodate people who couldn't grasp a doorknob and turn it. So if you had an amputation of one of your arms, you weren't able to open a door with a doorknob without some really crazy, you know, like it was very difficult. Your life wasn't made easier because of a doorknob. So they added these levers so you could just push it down and open a door, which, you know, initially, again, was for a very small subset of people. But this ended up helping so many people with limited dexterity or strength. Again, elderly people. It doesn't take that much force to open it. Or when's the last time you were carrying a bunch of things and you had to open a door, like carrying groceries or taking tools in and out, and you could actually reach a lever with your foot or your elbow or something? Like, you are benefiting immensely from this thing that was initially intended for a small subset of people. So I really like this quote as well. Accessible design recognizes that disability happens at the point of interaction between people and their environment. This, I think, is very, very important because it kind of goes hand in hand with how we talk about it. So we don't want to say, this is an amputee. Instead, it's a person who has amputations. We're thinking about them as a person first. So when we start thinking in that mindset, we start to understand that a disability is it doesn't exist until there is a gap between what they are trying to do and what they are able to do. So we are kind of creating disabilities when we do not accommodate things, and that recognizing that it happens at the point of interaction between people and their environment. And in our case, the environment is the website. It is the application we're building. It's online. That's the environment. So keeping in mind that we are a part of this and that we can be a part of the solution as well, which is awesome. Okay, this leads us into the empathy gap. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I know that a lot of this is not technical, that we are talking about very kind of soft skills here. And we're talking about interpersonal empathy, like stuff that's not generally associated with web development or engineering. But I think it's really important. It's absolutely the most important part of this. Anybody can learn the skills. Anybody can go on MDN and go read up about accessibility and learn what tags you need to use, things like that, which I do want to touch on that. It's super important, but you're not going to reach for these tools if you don't really believe that it's valuable and you don't understand that it has some purpose. So that's kind of why we're digging into this from this perspective so much. Just so you guys know. Okay, so let's talk about the empathy gap. The empathy gap is an interesting concept that I really like within web accessibility. So the definition of empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. That's the definition of the word, like the dictionary definition. Empathy requires understanding, and closing the empathy gap requires knowledge, acknowledging our biases. So the empathy gap is basically saying that we cannot appreciate where another person is coming from until we understand the difficulties they're going to face in trying to accomplish these things. So a lot of people, and you'll read articles on accessibility about talking about closing the empathy gap. And it's kind of like this buzzword a little bit, but it's kind of an abstract concept. But really the idea is we want to understand our users as much as we possibly can to be able to start closing that gap so that we can start understanding solutions that we can build that solve those problems. And I think one of the most important aspects of this is that empathy is not pity. And in case anybody doesn't do JavaScript, the exclamation mark equals is not equal to. So empathy is not pity. Pity is basically looking at someone and not understanding or having the information or knowledge that you need to kind of see them as a person. Like, we don't want to pity anybody. The whole point is to understand where they're coming from and then making accessible experiences to close that gap. No one benefits from pity. Okay, so then skills. So to close the empathy gap, we need to build new skills. It takes new skills to close that, and we have to understand how users with disabilities are interacting with our technology. Another part of this is acknowledging and understanding our own personal biases. So biases are just built into us. That's kind of how we operate as human beings. It's not a flaw. It's not like something that we should be ashamed of, because a bias is just your perspective. It's where you came from. So as I'm a white male who can see and has, opportunity, and I have a fast internet connection, and I have both my hands, and like I have all these things that build my bias. This is my bias in the way that I see things. So if I go in to build a website, it's not my initial direction to start thinking about a person who has low vision, how they're experiencing this, or a person with a single input device. That's not really where my brain naturally goes, because my bias is my own perspective. So we have to work towards getting beyond that and kind of looking outside of that box to get outside of our own bias. And that's a huge part of closing that empathy gap. One last piece that is a little bit more nuts and bolts and technical is that you will hear a lot about best practices. So, this is the best practice for building a modal. This is the best practice for an input on a form. And, often, especially when we're starting out in our careers, you never question those. You say, oh, it's the best practice. I'm just going to do it this way. But usually these best practices have been established by people who are very firmly lodged in some sort of bias. So when you're thinking about accessible experiences and building accessible websites, if you're putting yourself in that mindset of being empathetic, you are probably doing something that the people who created these best practices didn't do. So be ready to break from the best practices if it's necessary to create an accessible experience, because we want to prioritize the user over everything. Okay. So speaking of users, there is no average user. A lot of people talk about this, say the average user does this and this, or the average user is logging in at a certain time. And this is a bit of a fallacy. So the idea of an average user is kind of harmful to what we're developing towards. It's kind of like the idea of happy path in engineering. So if you're developing for just the happy path and you're not considering network outages or error paths, things like that, you're not going to build a very robust piece of software. And that's exactly the way it works for accessibility as well, is that we want to basically start thinking about the extremes, think about the absolute extremes of our users. And often that is complete blindness, or a single input device, things like that. Somebody on a phone in a very low internet connection, connected country, things like that. If we're thinking on the farthest ends of the spectrum, then we're casting this extremely wide net that we are catching so many more users than we ever would have been able to consider before. You're not going to be able to think of all the users because there is no average user. Everybody's all over the place. You may be the average user when you're sitting at your desktop computer at home, but when you are out and you are in a subway and you have 1 bar of LTE on your phone, you kind of aren't the average user anymore. So even you as an individual are going to change. So cast the wide net and you're going to cover all your bases here in a way that you never could have anticipated. Okay, let's dive into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of accessibility. This isn't going to be a super long section, but we're going to talk a little bit about stuff that you can do to implement into your own applications to benefit this. And I do want to mention really quickly that when we're talking about web accessibility, obviously this is set to a very specific subset of technologies. So we're talking about HTML, very strongly HTML, we're talking about JavaScript, and we're talking about CSS. Those are the 3 things that usually feed into accessibility when we're talking about it on the web. I would mention one piece that kind of is global. So when we're thinking about access to people, we can actually think about that within our code itself. So this would be agnostic of any programming language, but a lot of people, I think at a certain point in their career, they reach this point where they really love this terse algorithmic code that does everything as fast as, like in the one-liners, that are all these chained methods or whatever it may be, because it looks cool and it looks like you're smart and you know what you're doing. But there is a different way you could do it that is more human readable. I would argue that it is an accessibility concern to write code that can be readable by humans, and especially junior engineers. And it's really important that we write code that humans can read, because that's the whole point. The reason we have programming languages is so that humans can interact with machines and humans can talk to each other about the code that interacts with the machine. And when we are trying to be as nitty gritty as we can and make the coolest, shortest line of code, we're not really helping that cause. We're not helping the accessibility of other engineers in developing applications. That's something I like to think about. It's kind of just the umbrella that accessibility is a mindset. It's this broad way of thinking. It's not necessarily one specific thing. Okay, that was a total side, a rabbit hole there. But let's talk a little bit about HTML. So within HTML, there are a lot of different things that we can do to bring accessibility up in our application to really improve it. But I wanted to talk about 2 things because I don't want to overload you guys with take homes here. But if we're thinking about take homes, I'm going to give you 2 things for HTML, 2 things for CSS, and 2 things for JavaScript, just to keep in the forefront of your mind, and I'll obviously share out these slides as well. But these screenshots on the left are taken from MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, which is a great resource. I encourage you to check that out for anything you need, JavaScript related and front end related. But okay, let's talk about heading tags. So when you're on a website and you see the big font, that's the very first word or the very first title or whatever for the site, that is usually an H1, a heading level 1 tag. Now, heading tags have 6 different levels, that H1 through an H6. And basically, if you were to go in and just write out what they have here on the left, it's going to look like what's rendered here in the center, where it's slightly different styles. It's, it's bolder, and then it gets smaller versus the size there. But and a lot of people use these because they want that kind of styling aspect of the heading tag, but that is really not the purpose of them at all. The whole point of the heading tag is to create a hierarchy and to create semantic meaning within your markup. So HTML is a markup language. So when we talk about the tags that you see laid out there, that's often referred to as the markup. And the reason that we want semantic meaning here is if somebody comes in with a screen reader, they're going to navigate through the page and get an overview of the page. The overview of the page is going to say, in this example, this page is about Beatles, because the H1 is Beatles, and then then there's a heading level 2, and it's about the morphology, and it kind of lays it out as if you're reading an article, and you can see where the new chapter headers are or whatnot. That's the meaning of semantic, is that it has value in and of itself, that it explains the purpose of the page. It doesn't just describe how it should be rendered. It actually explains the meaning and the purpose of it, which is really useful. And again, sorry, from a nuts and bolts perspective, there should only ever be one H1. So never reach for a heading level tag because you want it to look a certain way. Reach for your heading level tags because you want them to represent the content accurately. So there's only one H1, and then you don't usually want to skip tags at all. So you want to go from an H1 to an H2, and then you could have another H2, and then an H3 to an H4, H4, H4. So you don't want to skip levels that go down, because then it indicates that there's some kind of missing content there. So that's the one takeaway I would give you for heading level tags within HTML, which also we already kind of talked about semantic HTML elements, so our second item here. But if you go and look through all the available HTML tags, you'll notice there are a ton of them. There's more than you've probably seen before. And they all have different values and meanings. So, there's a term called div soup. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but div soup is basically just every single element in your markup is a div. So you have your div, and then you have custom classes, and you're using your React, or you're using some library or Angular or whatever to then manipulate those divs to have interactivity and functionality and to look a certain way, but you are ripping out the semantic meaning of your page when you do that, and you have to basically put it back in there manually, which is a very complicated process and is totally usually laden with a lot of different bugs. So you always want to reach for semantic HTML elements and use the things that are natively built out of the box if possible. Okay, next up, let's talk about CSS. CSS, I only have 2 here. They're pretty straightforward. The contrast is kind of an obvious one, so just keep contrast high. On the left hand here, we have good contrast and bad contrast. It's immediately obvious why good contrast is better than bad contrast. So keep this in mind. One thing to look at too is, if you are in a hover state and you've changed the color of an element when you're hovering the mouse over it, is the contrast still good? What are the different states your application can be in, and are you keeping that contrast good? There are tools online you can use to actually evaluate the contrast, because there is an accepted level within the WCAG standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, where there's kind of a ranking system. It's A, AA, and AAA as far as how accessible your website is. Most people shoot for AA, the middle one, because design constraints, usually they want to have a little bit more leeway with that AA there. So you can actually go online, just look for a contrast checker, and all you have to do is drop in the hex code for one element and then drop in the hex code for the background element, and it'll tell you what your contrast is. And if it falls within that range. And yeah, this is one of the biggest pitfalls with CSS, surprisingly. And the next one is a bit of a gotcha that I don't know if it's a super well-known one, but when you are setting the font size of an element on your website, people often just reach for pixel values. They reach for px when they're sizing anything. You're putting a border on something, you're making the width of a modal, things like that. They're reaching for the pixel values. And this sometimes is fine, but when you're talking about fonts and fonts that are rendered onto the screen, you never, ever, ever want to use pixel values for fonts. The reason you don't want to use pixel values for fonts is because it sets it in stone. It becomes a very hard-coded, overridden value that can't be changed. So if someone has their default operating system set to triple the size of all text because they just need the text bigger to be able to read it, that will not be respected by a pixel value, but it will be respected by an REM value, which stands for root element. So the root element basically is this small chunk of CSS. Here is how it works. So we have the HTML, and we're targeting that with a font size of 16 pixels. So we're setting the root element, and the root element on a web page is always HTML. So we're targeting that tag and setting that font size to 16 pixels. And then now we're saying the font size for all of our H1s is 2 REMs. So in this case, 32 pixels. But the great thing is, because it's an REM, is whenever a user bumps up their font size, it will grow with the page. They'll be able to actually dynamically change that text. This is something that I see overlooked all the time, and it's one of the simplest things you can do. And you can also build in utility functions to map these things out. Like a lot of times people will use SAS or, any other preprocessor to basically build a function that says, pass in what pixel value you want this to be, and then it will translate it out and it will compile it down to an REM that actually gets rendered out to the browser. So the browser is interpreting REMs while you're passing in pixels as a developer, and you don't have to worry about it. So there's lots of things like that, but it's good to understand why this works and why this is important at the core of your application. So those are the two things for CSS. And JavaScript. So we're looking at interactivity on our pages. I maybe didn't even pick the best examples here as far as like takeaways that you could implement in your own code. There's so many things, but these are the ones that popped into mind. There is something called tab index that is it's a part of the HTML, but it also obviously interacts with JavaScript. This tab index is used to indicate whether or not an element can be focused by the keyboard. So when you hit the tab key and it moves between a button to an input to an input to a button, that is the tab order or the focus order of your page. And using tab index, you can manually set that. So for example, in this example here, we see a div with a tab index of 0. So a div is not normally a keyboard focusable element because it has no interactivity, it has no user input, there's no reason for it to be focused, but you can override that by using tab index. And a tab index of 0 means it is just set in the order of elements naturally. So, we have label, then we go to div, then we go to the next label. So that's the natural order that we would go through. A tab index of -1 will make an element it'll remove it from the tab index. So a -1 means you won't be able to tab through it. A good example of this is if you have a custom radio group. So have you guys ever noticed with radio buttons, if you're going through a form and you hit tab, so you have your input, and then it takes you to the first radio button in a group, and then you hit tab and it'll take you out of the entire group to the next input. So that is an example of tab index -1, because all the other options within that radio group are given a tab index of -1, meaning that they're not going to get focused. But when you go into that group again and you push down arrow, down arrow, down arrow, and it's going to select the third or fourth item in the list, then that is the one with tab index 0, and all the other ones have tab index -1. So that's programmatically set, and that's the way that radio groups are supposed to function. And another reason to use native elements is if you use the native elements for radio, it'll do that automatically. But if you hand roll that, you're going to have to set all that functionality yourself. But that's how tab index works. And if you build a custom interactive element, you need to make sure you're handling your tab index correctly. And then kind of related to that is ARIA. So this is a huge topic and something I would really encourage you guys to go ahead and research if you haven't heard of this before. But ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And all that this is you can think of ARIA as the CSS for screen readers. So it is the non-visual CSS of the web, where you can go in and say, that, what is the role of this element? And a great example here is pop-ups or toasters. So when a toaster pops up on the screen, that's a huge accessibility challenge, because as a sighted user, you see that and you're like, oh, my attention is immediately brought to that element, and I know what the content is and the purpose of it. It said that I deleted a file successfully, or there was a network connection problem, something like that. But as a screen reader user, you're not necessarily aware that something changed on the page. So you can use an ARIA attribute to set on that and say, hey, there's something called ARIA Live, where you can create a region where whenever the DOM content changes in this region labeled with the ARIA attributes, you can immediately announce it to the screen reader. So as soon as a notification pops up, it'll actually interrupt itself and say, success, you saved your file. And then it'll continue speaking other things it was reading off the page. This is a really good thing to do here. And, if the format of this presentation was a little different, I would have gone through a screen reader example using VoiceOver on my Mac here. But it's a little confusing when the audio starts reading and it's yelling at you and you're trying to present. But I definitely encourage you guys to go and watch the tutorial on it and try it out. Try to use it if you can. Okay, so this is kind of just another overview page. Like I said, I'll share out these slides. This is a couple extra things. So just thinking about the nuts and bolts of accessibility. You're designing your application. There's accessibility there. You're looking at your HTML. There's accessibility there. You're thinking about your logic and your JavaScript, which a lot of people wouldn't associate that with accessibility, but there's tons there. CSS, obviously lots of accessibility. Accessibility is everywhere. And when you are designing and developing and engineering, it doesn't matter what it is. You could be writing Laravel, you could be writing PHP. There's accessibility in everything. It's a mindset that we want to foster that's built around empathy and kindness and inclusion. And it just makes everything better, is like the core of it. And it's my favorite part of the web, and it's my favorite part of engineering. And I think that it's really fun. And that when you see someone use your tool or use your application in a way that is different, and they're able to navigate and they're able to do things that, you are making this place open to everyone. That's a really great feeling. And honestly, it's super valuable to companies, because there's been a lot of lawsuits around this as well. And this is something that I don't usually like to harp on, like, as far as getting people excited about accessibility, because I think it's kind of a negative reason to get into it. But there is a business value in this, because a lot of companies get sued for not having, accessible applications, which, again, like I said, I think it's a bad reason to do it. I think empathy should be the number one reason you do this. But as far as making money and having a job where you work in accessibility, that's probably your number one route into it. So this is a great skill to have. The heartless businesses want it for that reason, but we can do it for the right reasons. But yeah, that's web accessibility. Looks like we're about 45 minutes here. I haven't looked at the chat yet to see if we have any questions rolling in, but I'm going to go ahead and close this out and stop sharing my screen.
All right.
And we can talk a little bit.
Thank you for sharing these useful concepts and the interesting analogies as well about accessibility. It's kind of like opened up a new perspective for me. Yeah, definitely.
Great.
And now it's time for a Q&A session. Feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions or post them in the chat.
I had a quick question. So you said you were a full stack developer before this. I just want to know, which one did you, I guess, prefer or like more, had like more of a fun time, I guess, in, if it was like in full stack or if it was in web development?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was doing full stack, to be totally transparent, it was Node.js. So it was all JavaScript based. So Node.js, it was Angular, old Angular, before Angular 2 even came out. That was kind of more of my full stack work. I was working in microservices, building out APIs, things like that, which I did really enjoy. I like that a lot. But my background personally is more from a design area, like more artistic. It's just kind of been what I've always been interested in. So I was drawn to engineering and development because I wanted to create things that ended up on the web that you could see. And like, I was selfish enough to want my work to be visible. So for me personally, I enjoy the front end a lot more more, because I get to see my work rendered out. And I like to design things and then develop them as well. So if you're a person who's artistically inclined and you're like, oh, I could make this look this way and then actually turn it into code and put it on the page, that's really gratifying. But I know a lot of people hate that. A lot of people hate CSS. So, just thinking about what you're interested in, and you'll probably figure that out pretty quickly.
All right. Anyone else?
Oh yeah, my cat. Yep. She's back there. She's always hanging out. I'm surprised the dogs didn't come in here and start fighting.
Personally, actually, in my early passion projects, like web accessibility wasn't my thing at all. Like wasn't a primary consideration for me at all. I don't know how many people are here have same experience. So do you believe it should be like web accessibility should be integrated at a higher level or like even initial level in all projects? What do you think?
Yeah, totally. So you mean like if you're making a personal fun project for like a side project, should you consider it? Yeah, so that's a great question. Obviously, there is the element of who's using this, like if you are making a video streaming service, then there's a natural kind of exclusion for certain groups. You want to try to work as hard as you can to accommodate everybody as broadly as you can with things like closed captions. Oh, there's the dog I was talking about. I don't even know what he's doing. But yeah, so obviously you have to use your judgment with like what kind of application you're building. If you're building in, Spotify, then people who are deaf are not really going to benefit a whole lot from Spotify. But that is something you have to just think about as you're doing it. But to actually answer your question about developing personal projects, most personal projects of mine, 80% of it is because I want to learn something, is because I'm trying out some new thing or I'm trying to figure out a new technology. And that is the grounds that you want to build the practice of implementing this stuff in, because I mean, if you're doing a personal project and you're practicing writing tests for your code, like if you're using Jest or Cypress or Playwright or Puppeteer or anything like that, because you're like, oh, I want to write tested code or test driven code even, then if you're doing that, like you should do accessibility as well. Like you should implement that stuff, if it's for best practices, you should. If it's literally just a throwaway thing, like, obviously you do whatever you want, but ideally our personal projects are to learn. So I would say, yeah, it's a good practice to have.
Gotcha. So yeah, as you just mentioned, like the big companies, they have to take this into consideration, right? Otherwise they might get into like a lawsuit or whatever. I remember like a Google speaker like went to CDI to have a speak session before, and he emphasized that even at Google they dedicate a department for like web accessibility. Yeah, that really surprised me. Yeah.
Oh yeah, web accessibility is huge. I mean, with and I think that most companies, they realize that the real goal is just to be user-centric. If you have a user-centric product and you're a user-centric company, then that is built into what you're doing. But the litigation is always it's always there, so it's hanging over people's heads. Okay, let's see. We got let me go down the list here. What's an example of an accessibility project you've worked on that you're willing to share? Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So when I worked at T-Mobile, that's where I did a majority of my accessibility work. And, one of the things that we worked on was a lot of form components. So we were building out a new component library, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's, this one specifically was built in React, where the idea is we have a design system where we say, the designers have put together kind of these Lego block foundations of this is what the fonts are going to look like, and this is what the spacing looks like, and this is what all of our modals look like. And you kind of compose these components together to build these pieces that are very consistent and aligned with the design. And we were on a core front end team. So what we did was we built out these React components that would then render the actual HTML that's consumed by the page. And we would put these components in a library that was then published as a package, like an NPM package. And then other engineers that were on feature engineering teams would pull down that published package when they were developing something. Let's say there was a new a user flow, like a sign up flow that they were developing. They would pull down that package and then start pulling in those components. And they don't have to worry about the UI. They don't have to worry about how it looks. They don't have to worry about spacing, any of that stuff, because they're they're pulling in automatically accessible and well-designed components that fit the design system. So that was kind of the area of work that I worked in. And one of the things we were doing was this very complicated nested form thing where you would open up an accordion and then there were like multiple radio buttons. And then as you select one radio button, like other things change on the page. And it was really a nightmare, honestly. Like we all hated it. Like it wasn't what we wanted to do. And it wasn't a very accessible thing out of the box. But I got to work with this guy named Charlie Triplett, who is a huge accessibility advocate. And I learned a lot of things from him, but I loved working with him because he would just push back. He would just say like, no, like we're not going to ship an inaccessible product. And, you know, he fought really hard to, you know, which fight is the wrong word. It was collaboration at the end of the day, but he pushed really hard against that and saying like, you know, this is basically like putting out a product that just sends a user to a 404 page. Like you would never ship something that affects this other subset of our users as negatively as this affects, you know, our users with disabilities. So like, why are you willing to ship it out if it's, you know, if it's this broken? So like kind of hearing his mindset and listening to him and learning from him and understanding how he was a little bit more like, you know, gruff than I probably would have been. But that was a project I loved working on because, you know, at the end of the day, like we still finished that project and shipped that feature and built something that worked for our users. But we did go back to the drawing board in a lot of ways and said, hey, like, you know, these elements shouldn't change the page when you select them. There's got to be a different way we could design this. Or like, you know, we shouldn't have interactive elements between radio buttons, which is something they were doing. You know, all these things were kind of anti-patterns that people weren't aware of, which is fine. But, you know, having an organization that's willing to sacrifice speed for that kind of quality was really valuable. And you don't get that culture unless you get people pushing back in a respectful and collaborative way. That's one example that I really liked.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing the insights. Any other questions? If you have any other question, you could just, okay. So we have a question posted by Trisha. To comment how I use and many others use web accessibility, such as dark mode, closed captions, or something as simple as pressing tab on websites, etc. And it makes me appreciate and opens my eyes to web accessibility when it's generally overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So that's that curb cut effect in action, you know, where we all get to benefit from these things. I heard that like the number of people who are using closed captions to watch Netflix is like growing just incredibly fast. Like people almost there's a majority of people just leave them on all the time, which is great. You know, it's an awesome example of that. But yeah, I'm glad that, you know, you're aware of those things as you're navigating, because that's really fun. It's really cool to see those things and appreciate them for where they came from, really. Because I think that we take those things for granted now. When I go skateboarding, I use curb cuts as ramps sometimes, you know, like that's you know, you forget that this thing is there and it benefits all of us because it was, you know, really pioneered by people who are accessibility advocates. Yeah. Kanti said, I didn't know web accessibility was so much work to implement, yet it's 100% worth it. So many features have been added for accessibility that I use every day. I'm glad we're moving that way in tech. Yeah, definitely. It is, you know, it is complicated, but the hardest part of web accessibility is just like the ground level, like all the stuff we talked about here today. Just kind of like getting your head around why it matters is the hardest part. And that's it. You know, beyond that, like everybody knows way more complicated stuff. You guys are engineers, you know? So like, that's not the hard part. The implementation isn't any harder than anything else we do. It's just getting people on the same page and getting people on board, you know, getting buy-in.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, closed captions.
Yeah, I definitely
Yeah.
agree. Yeah, it's kind of like opened up a new perspective for me as well, like today. Like,
I'm glad.
Any more questions? If not, I'm gonna wrap it up our today's session. And thank you for joining us today, Mikel, and sharing your insights and chance on web accessibility.
Yeah.
Personally, I've learned a lot from this session. Hopefully all of you here, you know, have the same thing as I do. So I hope we can have you back in the future as a speaker again, like sharing more.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to. Absolutely.
web development with us. And also, will you be open to connecting
Yes.
on LinkedIn?
Oh my gosh, my dog is bugging the heck out of me. Yeah, absolutely. I will send out, I'll work with you, Luke, to make sure that I get the slide deck sent out and to make sure that everybody has, my LinkedIn and my email and whatnot. I'd love to hear from you guys. This is super close to my heart, and like, just hit me up if you want help, if you want to talk about anything, like, even just career advice in general. Like I like teaching and whatnot too. So feel free. Very, very open.
Yeah. Thanks so much. And I believe this session is very informative. Yeah. And
Glad. Yeah.
so for other people, I can see your dog. You have a lot
Now they're fighting. Yeah.
of attention. Yeah. So before we leave, could you for all the people here, please take a moment to fill out our event post survey, and you will receive an email for that. So yeah, thank you for joining us, and we wish you have a great Thanksgiving break, and hope to see you at our next event. Have a good night.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
See you later.
See you. All right. If you guys have any questions, feel free to stay. We are happy to answer. Otherwise, y'all have a good night, and thank you for coming. All right.
Dogs are so cute. Can you see them?
Let me stop sharing. Stop recording.